It took exactly 47 seconds for the room to shift from controlled calm to stunned disbelief. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, eyes locked on Patel, as the unthinkable happened. A lie, spoken in private, laid bare on camera for every senator, every legal observer, and the nation to witness. Silence followed, heavy, unbroken, irreversible. The Senate Intelligence Committee hearing room was suffused with the sterile glow of overhead fluorescent lights, each panel reflecting faintly off the polished mahogany tables. Microphones stood like sentinels, thin cords snaking across the floor, capturing every syllable, every half-step of foot movement. Cameras angled from multiple perspectives, one overhead, one at eye level with the senators, another trained exclusively on Patel, broadcasting the room's tension in near real time. The faint hum of air conditioning was the only sound, masking the quickened breaths of those seated around the horseshoe of tables. Patel sat rigid, a man in a dark suit that seemed to swallow light, his tie taut, hands clasped tightly in front of him. His eyes darted to Crockett and back to the rows of silent spectators, the subtle flick of his right hand betraying nerves he refused to acknowledge. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, radiated a measured composure. Her fingers rested lightly on her notes, eyes scanning the prepared questions but always returning to the man across the table. The slight furrow of her brow and the tilt of her head carried a quiet threat, one built on preparation, authority, and the weight of law. The senators flanking Crockett exuded restrained authority. One scribbled notes in fine handwriting, another tapped a pen rhythmically, each motion punctuating the thickening atmosphere. Staffers in the rear, some holding tablets, others whispering under their breath, added to the sense of high-stakes orchestration. Every eye seemed to anticipate the inevitable misstep, every silent beat a countdown. Patel had prepared for this hearing with exhaustive precision, or so he thought. Internal memos, redacted reports, budgetary spreadsheets, and classified operational files lined his digital briefing folders. Yet the cameras were live, a silent jury, waiting. He believed one angle was off, that a moment of candor would remain unseen. That calculation, that misjudgment, would define the next hour. The chamber smelled faintly of polished wood and recycled air, a subtle reminder of institutional authority. The sunlight outside filtered through tall, narrow windows, creating rectangles of light that slanted across the committee tables, falling on unblinking eyes, on trembling hands, on sheets of legal references. Each moment passed with the deliberate weight of consequence, a cinematic rhythm that alternated between the mechanical click of pen tips and the imperceptible shuffling of papers. And then it began. Crockett asked the first question, calm, precise, legal in its construction. Mr. Patel, can you confirm whether the internal communications dated March 14th align with your previous testimony regarding the surveillance directive? Patel hesitated, a fraction of a second too long, as cameras captured a twitch of the jaw, a tightening grip on the table. The room inhaled collectively, and for that instant, the veneer of control fractured. The audience would not hear the answer for another heartbeat, but the cameras had already seen too much. The opening volley had set the tone. Every subsequent motion, the tapping of fingers, the subtle sideways glance, the quiet exhalation, would carry the tension forward. The chamber held its breath. The law, the cameras, and Crockett's unwavering gaze combined into an invisible magnifying glass, scrutinizing each micro-expression, each misstep. Patel's first faltering words hung in the room like smoke. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet for those attuned to congressional hearings, it was the first crack in a dam. The session would only intensify, but for now, the silence reigned. Crockett's eyes never wavered, and in that calm, measured gaze lay the promise of exposure. The soft click of a pen closing marked the end of the first round of questioning. But the silence wasn't over yet. The first round of questioning had barely ended when Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm yet carrying the weight of inevitability. Mr. Patel, regarding the memorandum circulated on January 9th, did you instruct any subordinate to withhold information from the Senate Intelligence Committee? Her words were measured, precise, every syllable a scalpel, dissecting ambiguity. Patel's fingers twitched under the table, his notes fluttering like trapped wings. He paused, inhaling slowly, a faint tremor betraying the composure he fought to maintain. The cameras angled slightly, catching the micro-expressions. The tightening of lips, the slight furrow above the brow. A shallow exhale that could be mistaken for calmness, but wasn't. Yes, he began, then hesitated. I did not. He cut himself off, eyes flicking toward the committee clerk who discreetly adjusted a microphone. The room's silence thickened. The senators' gazes remained fixed, their pens poised. Each had memorized the internal chain of communications, the dates, the signatures. They knew where Patel could trip, and they were waiting. Senator Jackson, seated to Crockett's left, interjected with a measured, almost surgical question. Under 18 U.S. Code Section 1001, knowingly providing false statements to Congress constitutes a felony. Are you aware of that statute, Mr. Patel? Patel's hand tightened, a vein pulsing in his temple. I am aware, he replied, though the hesitation left a crack wide enough to see through. Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly, the corners of her mouth pressing into a line that conveyed subtle disapproval, legal certainty, and restrained anticipation. The senators took turns, their questions increasing in precision and legal specificity. Did the January 9th memorandum accurately reflect the actual surveillance operations conducted under FISA Section 702? Crockett asked. Patel's throat tightened. His mind raced. FISA memos, classified redactions, budgetary oversights. Yes, it was accurate to the best of my knowledge, he replied, each word weighed, each syllable deliberate. Yet the cameras captured the brief pause before the last word, a hesitation that, though slight, betrayed internal conflict. Senator Reed, from across the chamber, added, "You were advised multiple times by the department's legal counsel to ensure all directives complied with the Appropriations Act of 2023. Can you confirm compliance?" Patel's hand moved to smooth his notes, a gesture meant to disguise panic. "To my knowledge, compliance was maintained," he said. But the subtle quiver in his fingers and the brief downward flick of his eyes betrayed uncertainty, a visual punctuation that the audience and legal analysts would notice immediately. Crockett pressed further, leaning closer. "Mr. Patel, Section 702 requires a documented chain of authority for any surveillance directive. Can you produce those records?" Patel swallowed, his lips dry, and shifted slightly in his seat. The cameras captured the moment as his hand hovered above a stack of classified folders. The silent tension was palpable, every eye in the chamber fixated on the man who believed he had prepared for every possible question. A faint scratch of a pen echoed from the clerk's table, punctuating the silence like a clock striking midnight. Notes were scribbled, fingers adjusted, papers shuffled. Each senator's eyes remained unwavering. Each word Patel spoke was now measured against constitutional clauses, statutory requirements, and internal memos he had hoped would never see the light of day. And in that controlled chamber, under the sterile fluorescent lights, a seed of doubt had been planted, a fissure in Patel's carefully constructed narrative. But the silence wasn't over yet. The room seemed to shrink around Kash Patel as Crockett's voice cut through the thick, tense air. "Mr. Patel, we have reviewed internal communications dated February 21st. They directly contradict your prior testimony regarding the allocation of surveillance resources. How do you reconcile these discrepancies?" Patel's eyes darted toward the folder in front of him, fingers brushing the edge of redacted pages. The mahogany surface reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, casting sharp shadows across his face. A bead of sweat traced the line of his temple. For a man trained to manage exposure, every camera angle now felt like a microscope. He swallowed. Those communications, they were preliminary assessments. They were not final operational orders. Crockett's lips pressed together. "Preliminary assessments," she repeated slowly, almost contemplatively. "And yet, under 50 U.S. Code Section 1881A, any directive affecting U.S. persons requires formal authorization. Preliminary or not, these actions fall squarely under that statute. Were you aware of this?" Patel hesitated. His throat tightened, and for a split second, he looked not at the senators, but at the ceiling, as if seeking escape. I believed the procedures were consistent with guidance," he said, a faint tremor betraying uncertainty. Senator Jackson leaned forward, voice firm but controlled. Mr. Patel, internal memos show that 2 of your subordinates raised concerns about the surveillance practices on March 3 and March 7. Section 702 of FISA explicitly requires that objections be documented and escalated. Why were these concerns not reported? Patel's hand rose to the stack of documents, shaking slightly. They were addressed internally. You addressed internally, Crockett interjected sharply, her tone clipped, precise. But Section 702's chain of accountability is explicit. Any deviation, any failure to report, violates the statute and potentially the Constitution's Fourth Amendment protections. Are you now claiming that internal notes suffice to bypass formal reporting? Patel's voice wavered. No. He paused, blinking rapidly. I believed. A soft click echoed from a senator's tablet as someone referenced an internal email. The overhead camera caught Patel's gaze flicker toward it, eyes widening slightly. Crockett's hand hovered over her notes but didn't move. She let the silence work like gravity, pressing him downward. Mr. Patel, Crockett continued, calm but unrelenting, the Appropriations Act of 2023 explicitly forbids the use of allocated funds for any activity that has not received documented congressional authorization. Internal communications suggest expenditure on operations outside those appropriations. Are you aware of this violation? Patel swallowed hard. His mind raced through operational budgets, classified approvals, and meeting notes. The room was no longer just a Senate hearing. It was a judicial chamber in miniature. Every syllable, every hesitation, now had institutional weight. I thought, he began, then faltered. Crockett leaned slightly forward, her gaze steady, almost judicial. Mr. Patel, under the Fifth Amendment, every person is afforded due process. You have obligations to this committee. Were you truthful in your prior testimony? For the first time, Patel's composure cracked. The slight twitch of his hand, the narrowing of his eyes, the brief downward tilt of his head, all cinematic signals captured in real time by the committee's cameras. The contradictions, the redacted emails, the missing approvals, they converged. His carefully rehearsed narrative was unraveling. The room fell into a controlled hush. Microphones recorded every microsecond of silence, the faint shuffle of papers, the barely audible scribble of notes. Crockett's gaze never wavered. Every senator sat poised, waiting for the inevitable. Patel's voice was barely audible. I must review the documentation. Crockett's eyes remained fixed. You may review, but the record is already clear. The discrepancies are on the official record, and the implications are serious. The cameras held their focus, and the room waited for the moment that would define the hearing. But the silence wasn't over yet. It began with a subtle shift, a tightening of Patel's jaw, a blink too long, a hand hovering above his notes that trembled ever so slightly. The cameras, unforgiving in their angles, captured it all. Jasmine Crockett's calm gaze did not falter, though the chamber seemed to pulse with an almost palpable anticipation. 47 seconds stretched like an eternity. Mr. Patel, Crockett said, her voice deliberate, controlled, the committee has on record your statement from March 14 claiming all surveillance operations were properly authorized. Yet, internal communications reviewed today demonstrate otherwise. How do you respond? Patel opened his mouth, then paused. The pen in his hand rattled against the table. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. For 47 seconds, nothing happened, but in that stillness, the weight of exposure pressed down on him. Every micro-expression, every hesitation, every involuntary flicker of the eyes was being scrutinized, not just by the senators, but by the cameras and the nation beyond them. He tried to speak. Words failed. The statute under 18 U.S. Code Section 1001, the prohibition against knowingly making false statements to Congress, loomed in the room like a phantom. The Fifth Amendment, meant to protect citizens from self-incrimination, offered no comfort when internal memos, FISA Section 702 notifications, and Appropriations Act directives formed an unbreakable chain of evidence against him. Crockett's hand rested lightly on her notes, the only visible motion in the room, as she let the silence press. Mr. Patel, she repeated, calm, but sharper now, are you asserting that these discrepancies do not exist? Patel's head tilted slightly, eyes darting across the committee table. The sweat on his temple caught the fluorescent light. The tilt of his hands, now tightly clasped, reflected the collapse of composure. His training, his preparation, and every internal calculation he had made in the past months were unraveling in a cinematic unraveling captured from 3 angles. The senators leaned in, but their faces remained unreadable. The weight of legal expectation combined with institutional scrutiny, a perfect storm that Patel could not deflect. Every second that passed cemented the gravity of his exposure. The Appropriations Act violation was one. The FISA 702 breach another. Misrepresentation to Congress the third. The convergence of statutory violations, constitutional obligations, and undeniable evidence left no room for escape. And then, as if the world had slowed, Patel's voice cracked, almost imperceptibly. I. The repetition, the stammer, the failure to articulate a coherent defense, became the visible and audible evidence of legal and institutional collapse. For 47 seconds, he was trapped in a cinematic limbo, neither fully speaking nor fully silent, yet entirely exposed. Crockett's calm gaze never wavered. The chamber held, frozen in the tension between law and human failure. The microphones, the cameras, the witnesses, all captured the precise moment when competence collapsed under scrutiny, and the legal consequences became inescapable. A pen dropped somewhere behind the room, sounding like a gunshot in the prolonged stillness. Heads shifted imperceptibly. Notes were scribbled. The mahogany tables reflected the harsh lights above, highlighting the faint sheen of sweat on Patel's forehead. Every element underscored the inevitability. In law, in politics, and in human failure, there are moments from which there is no recovery. And when the 47 seconds ended, the room exhaled as one, knowing history had just witnessed the unraveling. But the silence wasn't over yet. The moment Patel faltered did not stay confined to the Senate chamber. Within minutes, news networks across the nation were replaying the 47-second collapse in real time, each angle emphasizing his hesitation, the tremor in his hands, the imperceptible but undeniable flickers of panic. The chyron on one major network read, Patel exposed, congressional hearing turns into public reckoning. Anchors spoke with calm urgency, dissecting every pause, every line of testimony, while legal analysts mapped each failure to statutory and constitutional frameworks. Constitutional scholars called it the most devastating Senate takedown since Watergate. One anchor reported, voice measured yet tinged with awe. For 47 seconds, America watched competence collapse under scrutiny, with legal violations now clearly documented. Social media erupted almost instantly. Clips of Patel's hesitation, his broken cadence, and Crockett's unwavering composure were shared millions of times, annotated with commentary from former DOJ officials, policy experts, and constitutional law professors. FISA Section 702, 18 U.S. Code Section 1001, the Appropriations Act, all became common phrases in news feeds. Analysts explained how each infraction could cascade into formal investigations, subpoenas, and internal reviews. Meanwhile, Capitol Hill buzzed with hushed discussions. Senators convened in small clusters outside the chamber, referencing the transcripts and internal memoranda. Conversations blended legal jargon with political calculus. He thought he could hide behind internal notes. Section 702 doesn't allow that. The committee's record now stands as irrefutable evidence, one aide whispered. Legal publications dissected every angle. Law journals highlighted the constitutional implications: violation of due process, misrepresentation to Congress, misuse of appropriated funds. Editorials painted the incident as a stark reminder that institutional accountability is not merely ceremonial. It is enforceable, precise, and unforgiving. Across the FBI and DOJ, internal review teams quietly mobilized. Every memo, every directive, and every financial allocation Patel had touched now faced renewed scrutiny. Compliance officers flagged operations that lacked proper authorization. Supervisors reviewed prior assessments to determine whether systemic failures existed or if Patel's decisions were isolated. In the public sphere, reactions were immediate but varied. Some hailed Crockett's methodical approach as a triumph of institutional integrity. It was procedural, professional, and precise, commented one former senator. Every question built upon the last, exposing truth with legal and moral clarity. Others debated the consequences, questioning whether political careers should hinge on such visible, yet human, moments of error. Meanwhile, Patel remained under intense institutional and media pressure. Office doors, once familiar, now seemed distant. Staffers whispered in corridors. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Each subsequent day reinforced the idea that the 4 to 7 second collapse was not merely a fleeting embarrassment. It was the defining moment of his tenure, captured, analyzed, and remembered. The chamber itself, once a stage of poised authority, became a symbol of consequence. The microphones that had recorded every word, the cameras that had captured every twitch, and the committee notes now served as indelible records. Legal scholars, journalists, and political analysts agreed. Patel's failure was not just personal. It represented a tangible breach of law, procedure, and institutional trust. And yet, amid the media frenzy, the committee hearings continued. Questions remained unanswered, memos awaited review, and the public's gaze refused to relent. The reverberations of that single moment stretched far beyond the mahogany tables and fluorescent lights. But the silence wasn't over yet. The Senate chamber, once alive with questions, murmurs, and the subtle tension of live scrutiny, now sat in quiet aftermath. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly on polished mahogany, illuminating empty chairs and scattered notes that testified to a confrontation already etched into institutional memory. Outside, the sun had shifted, slanting long rectangles of light across the marble floors, as if marking time itself in a subtle, judicial rhythm. Patel's public and professional life had fractured under the scrutiny of 4 to 7 seconds. Yet the room's emptiness held more than just the echoes of exposure. It held the weight of law, accountability, and the imperatives of institutional rigor. Every pause, every flicker, every hesitated word had mattered. The constitutional obligations, the Fifth Amendment protections, statutory mandates under FISA 702, and the Appropriations Act, were no abstract ideals. They were precise instruments of governance, now visibly tested and confirmed through scrutiny. Jasmine Crockett remained at the chamber's center, a figure of calm authority. Her notes lay neatly stacked. Her eyes, though tired, reflected not triumph but duty. For her, the moral closure was not about spectacle. It was about the balance of responsibility and the integrity of process. She had done her part. Every question calibrated, every legal nuance deployed, every observation sharpened by both knowledge and patience. Across the nation, political commentators and legal scholars parsed the events. Some focused on Patel's misjudgment, others on the procedural choreography that exposed it. Yet beneath the analysis, one truth prevailed. Law and accountability were inseparable from leadership. A single misstep, amplified under the lens of scrutiny and institutional expectation, could ripple across careers, agencies, and public trust. In quiet reflection, the chamber itself seemed to whisper lessons that extended beyond individual culpability. The microphones still hummed faintly. The overhead cameras, now idle, had recorded a microcosm of human fallibility in the orbit of law. Documents stacked in neat piles reminded observers that evidence, procedure, and due diligence were permanent, even when individuals were fleeting. Patel's reputation, public perception, and political capital would not recover quickly, if at all. Yet the event was more than the downfall of one official. It was a testament to the architecture of accountability. The institutional machinery had functioned as designed. Questions measured, records verified, statutes cited, and human error laid bare without embellishment. In the aftermath, the chamber retained its austere dignity. Legal mandates, constitutional protections, and procedural rigor persisted, unshaken by spectacle, impervious to media spin. Some careers end in scandal. Others, like Patel's, end in silence, each serving as a reminder that Washington does not punish ignorance. It replaces it. The sun continued its slow descent, casting long, reflective shadows across the floor. Chairs sat empty. Microphones stood silent. The echoes of 47 seconds lingered in the space between light and shadow, law and consequence, human error and institutional permanence. Washington endures, not because of individual brilliance or failure, but because the system ensures that truth, law, and accountability survive even the most public unraveling. And in that quiet, empty chamber, the city exhaled, and so did the law.